Week 16 is in the books, but that doesn't mean the fantasy season is over if you lost in the semifinals. You can just hop over to DFS if you haven't been playing along, which kind of weird. You should have been, with programs like this one, the DFS Early Look, getting you ready earlier than most, if not all, for the Week 17 DFS slate. We have a ton of awesome games here on the main slate, a lot of great plays for you. And Jake Tribbey, who writes the DFS Early Look for FantasyPoints.com, has you covered. I can't wait to dive in. We're definitely getting to the top of the leaderboards with this early look. Let's lock in.
What? Why are you shaking your head? You're welcome.
I might have to be taking Jake's advice before we hit record and heading over to the DFS streets myself after some of the worst semifinal bad beats I've ever taken in fantasy football. So I'm looking forward to submitting some lineups. Jake, let's start with quarterback, and one of the people responsible for a very unfortunate weekend for many with how that game went, not what people expected, versus a pretty game Dallas Cowboys team. Let's talk about Baker Mayfield and how he can turn it around.
Yeah, so Mayfield has 7 games this season of 25 plus DraftKings points. That's a mark that ties for the league lead with Joe Burrow, Lamar Jackson, and Jaden Daniels. None of those guys are on the main slate, by the way. So if Baker Mayfield leads all slate eligible quarterbacks in ceiling games, is there any reason he should be $1,600 cheaper than the slate's quarterback one in a best possible matchup? Carolina ranks as the single softest schedule adjusted matchup for opposing quarterbacks since week 11. And this game offers the highest total on the main slate at 49.5. Over the last 2 years, Mayfield has scored over 26 DraftKings points in 4 of his 7 games with a total over 46.5, averaging 23.5 DraftKings fantasy points per game in those contests. You tack on a great matchup, and it's pretty easy to call him one of the best tournament plays of week 17.
Absolutely. A bounce back week for Baker is coming. And don't forget, Mike Evans is chasing history, and they are aware. I think he needs about 92 yards a game to get there, something close to that anyway. Let's talk about a running back and what a week it was for Jonathan Taylor. Only the second time this season he's hit 20 PPR points in a game, but he doubled that with 41. Is truly insane, the kind of game that he had. And there's a matchup here where he might do it again.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like I wrote it in the article, this feels almost too obvious. Taylor just recorded the 3rd best running back performance of the season, 42.8 DraftKings fantasy points. And now he gets a Giants defense that has struggled massively defending the run. New York ranks as the 4th softest schedule adjusted rushing defense this season, allowing the 2nd most rushing yards per game and the most yards after contact per attempt. Plus, the Colts are 8.5-point favorites here, and Taylor averages 28% more fantasy points per game in Colts wins over the last 2 seasons compared to losses. It's hard not to get excited about Taylor's upside in a must-win game for the Colts. And, as we get later in the season here, we see these teams fighting for playoff position really rely on their stars. Taylor, obviously, is one of those players.
The Colts pulled Taylor for a lot of, if not all of, the third quarter in the last game, and we weren't too happy about it in building, from what I gather, and the Titans almost came back in that game. I'm wondering if that's enough for them to keep Taylor in the game, to keep putting up the statistics, keeping everyone happy, which that means he could possibly even do better. Kind of an insane thought for a guy that quite literally broke the slate this weekend. Here's another running back for Minnesota against the Green Bay Packers. Huge division game. DraftKings has him as the RB11. So does FanDuel. Pretty good price for a running back we know can blow up.
Yeah, absolutely. So Aaron Jones earned an 82% snap share, which was his highest since week 8, on top of 96% of backfield touches in week 16. Now, that's incredible usage for a $6,200 running back, only Chase Brown, Chuba Hubbard, and DeAndre Swift earned a higher percentage of their team's backfield expected fantasy points last week. And this usage bump makes perfect sense. RB2 Cam Akers is averaging just 3.9 yards per carry, and Minnesota has a 21% probability to secure the number one seed in the NFC. So they need to ride their stars, as I alluded to previously with Jonathan Taylor for the Colts. And for Minnesota, that starts with Aaron Jones. And it only helps for fantasy purposes that this game has the second highest total of the main slate at 49. It's actually 2.5 points higher than the next highest game total. So I expect Jones to be considered a cash game play at just 6,200, given the game environment and the recent bump in playing time and usage relative to, again, just way too cheap of a price.
Yeah, somebody needs to contact Gerard Mayo so he learns that you don't need to bench a running back when they fumble a few times to keep trotting out inferior running backs routinely. That being said, let's talk wide receiver. And Brian Thomas Jr. is doing everything that Marvin Harrison Jr. fans were hoping to get: a second half breakout that doesn't require a points per block league. Let's talk about Brian Thomas Jr. versus Tennessee at wide receiver 7 on DraftKings, wide receiver 8 on FanDuel. This feels entirely too low.
Rookie wide receivers tend to break out in the second half of the season, and Brian Thomas Jr. is yet another example. Over the last 3 weeks, Thomas Jr. averages 24.6 expected fantasy points per game, 26.8 DraftKings fantasy points per game, and an absurd 45% first read target share. All of those numbers would lead all pass catchers over the full season. So why is Thomas being priced as a mid-range wide receiver 1 on just an 8-game main slate? I really have no idea, but I know I want plenty of tournament exposure here, even in a bottom 5 on paper matchup against Tennessee.
Absolute smash spot here with Tennessee. I love it. I'm going to be playing a lot of them, doing it with Mac Jones. I mean, absolute shout out. Let's talk about another rookie wide receiver who I am currently unhappy with personally, but we will move on in terms of DFS because the price is just too good at wide receiver 26 on DraftKings, wide receiver 26, on FanDuel at 5,900. Let's talk about Jalen McMillan, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers.
Yeah, so McMillan just led all Tampa Bay pass catchers in expected fantasy points on Sunday night, benefiting from a mid-game hamstring pull from Sterling Shepard. McMillan has earned double-digit expected fantasy points in 5 of his last 7 games, and he averages 20 DraftKings fantasy points per game over his last 3 games, a mark that would rank behind only Justin Jefferson among slate-eligible wide receivers over the full season. Now, this is a must-win spot for Tampa Bay. They have a 50% probability of winning the NFC South as things stand right now. And Carolina ranks as a fringe top 10 matchup according to recent schedule-adjusted numbers. If Sterling Shepard misses this game, McMillan is simply too cheap relative to his projected workload here. And like I said, a must-win game for Tampa Bay where you really wouldn't expect them to take their foot off the gas much.
Yeah, and hopefully it also means less Rachaad White. Let's talk about tight end. Another cheap option here that has big impact implications. Tight end 11 on DraftKings. FanDuel a little bit sharper at tight end 7 at 5,400. Let's talk about Chig Okonkwo.
Yeah, so Okonkwo averages 9.5 targets per game and 17 expected fantasy points per game over Mason Rudolph's last 2 starts, on top of a 36% first read target share. Those numbers easily lead the Titans over this span and would put Okonkwo in the conversation as a tight end 1 if he kept it up over the full season. I really don't think it's a coincidence, though. Okonkwo's targets per route run jumps from 0.13 in Will Levis's starts to 0.25 with Rudolph under center. So on a per route basis, he's being targeted about twice as often with Mason Rudolph under center compared to Will Levis. And I really think this comes down to target depth. Okonkwo's average depth of target is among the lowest on the Titans at just 5.5 yards downfield. Will Levis ranks 12th among 43 qualifiers at quarterback in average depth of target, while Rudolph ranks 31st. A renewed focus on attacking short, combined with the top 7 on paper matchup against Jacksonville, makes Okonkwo one of the best punt tight end plays of the week on what is, a relatively thin 8-game slate. So there aren't going to be as many punt tight end options as we've grown used to this season.
Definitely the type of player that can house it as well from multiple parts of the field. Jake, I'm excited for week 17. We have Christmas Day games that I'm just praying Netflix does not buffer through, because as a Ravens fan, I will lose my mind. So Netflix, I hope you learn from the Mike Tyson situation. Do not ruin this for us. We're going to need it. For Jake Tribbey, I'm Thomas Tipple. This is DFS Early Look. If you want the full article, that link is going to be in the description below when the article drops. We hope you guys have a wonderful holidays. Thank you for hanging out with us. We'll see you guys for next week's DFS Early Look, because with DFS, the season really never stops until the final whistle. Happy holidays, everybody. We'll see you guys next week for the DFS Early Look.